what I thought to start with was just a review of where mentoring, kind of things that mentoring is applied to. Because when we start with the concept of measurement, we always ask measurement for what? And the purpose of the mentoring program will significantly influence what we need to measure. So look at these things. Graduate recruitment. Thank you. If we're recruiting graduates, what do we want to find out? Well, we want to see how long they stay. We want to see how quickly they become effective. We want to see how committed they are to the job. And one of the things that we learnt from measuring what was happening with graduate recruits was that you didn't give them a mentor to start with. That you actually let them get into the organisation for a while, then you gave them a mentor, and then you made sure they had a mentor when they made that critical transition into their first line job, when they stopped having to, when they moved from managing themselves to managing other people. So we learned a lot simply from measuring what was happening in graduate recruitment about how we make the mentoring more effective. Supporting immigrants into the workplace, lots of programs to do this around the world. Indigenisation, by which we mean helping people helping large corporates to replace expats with locals. Now, people like Shell, we'd had a big program in Shell many years ago. Nothing had worked until the mentoring program came along. And the mentoring program was the one thing that shifted things, that enabled people to have the conversations with people with locals, that enabled them to be able to think like a manager. Diversity and equal opportunities, lots and lots of programs there. Some of you are deeply involved in these. Transitions in the leadership pipeline. The leadership pipeline is an interesting concept. The original work by Elliot Jacques, very well founded. Some of the stuff by Ramcharan and others is distinctly not so well founded. But essentially the notion that as you go through different levels of responsibility, the way that you have to think about your job changes. So that if you're managing yourself, that's one thing. If you're managing other people, it's another. If you're managing managers or managing an enterprise, then it all changes. And at those transitions, it's really important to have a mentor through each one of those transitions. Now, what we're measuring at each one of those points is different. And so what we measure and how we do it is important. By the way, we'll give you these slides. We don't have to take copious notes. We'll give you all the slides. Okay, we can do that, can't we? Yeah. Maternity mentoring, a big growth area. We've just been having a discussion about that with Esther. So this is I think one of the most exciting areas of mentoring. It goes back to the early 1990s. When the first organisation to experiment with maternity mentoring was the Prudential. And yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah. And the whole point, what we're finding is maternity mentoring is more powerful than maternity coaching. And the reason that is because maternity coaching brings in people from outside who may be qualified coaches and they may be accredited and so forth and can help you with thinking about your life and all the rest of it. But it's no substitute from somebody else at the same level who knows what it's like to move back into the organisation at that level, who knows the politics of the level and how things have changed since you left. Because every organisation is moving fast. And so the utility that you have in the organisation, what gave you meaning when you left the organisation, no longer is the same when you come back. Things have moved on. People have learned to get on without you. And this sense, both of the guilt of leaving the baby behind and this sense that actually you're not valued in the way you were before, this can be really devastating. So maternity mentor helps you to get through all this process. The small business report, retirement as well, mentoring into retirement. We've actually had programs of mentoring into death, terminal mentoring. And the interesting thing, of course, is you don't have to have had any experience before. Lots of mentoring programs for culture change. One organisation, for example, the critical thing was they had sent everybody off to Cranfield Business School to learn customer relationships management, and then they realised that they couldn't apply it because they didn't know how. They needed some people back in the organisation to support them in making it real, because the theoretical knowledge was not enough. And so, again, the measurement there was how quickly did people actually start to use what they'd learned. Disadvantaged children at risk, fascinating there. One of the things that we find frequently is that when we're thinking about the qualities of a mentee, what makes a great mentee, very often these inner city illiterate kids don't have any of the basic qualities we would look for in an effective mentee. They don't have respect for others, they don't have respect for themselves, they don't have the communication skills, etc., etc. So one of the key things we have to do is pre-mentoring. So one of the measures we're looking for there is has the program actually helped these people to become capable of being mentored? So completely different set of measures. Prevention of bullying at school. Quite a lot of programs are focusing on this, and interestingly, if there's a couple of years difference between the children, particularly kids that have maybe kids that are a little obese or have something else special about them, they've got a mentor who's another kid a couple of years older rather. That can be really helpful. And intriguingly, in some of the experiments that we've observed, if you take the kids that are worst behaved, the tearaways, and give them somebody to be mentored to, they get such a sense of self-efficacy that they actually start to change their behaviours. So one of the things we're looking at in those programs is not just the emotions and where the mentee is, but what's actually happening for them for this young mentor. So again, different purpose, different context for the measurement. People entering higher education, Oxford has a great program for people who are paraplegic or hemiplegic. Ex-offenders, trauma victims, soldiers, lots of programs for these. Executive hires, that's the boring bit. And the last one there is knowledge transfer. Some organisations have been really looking at how mentoring, focusing mentoring, IBM for example. The majority of IBM's mentoring programs are focused on knowledge transfer. And the idea behind this is that in order to maintain its competitiveness in the marketplace, people have got to be sharing knowledge in a much higher level and rate than it happens normally. And so the mentoring program, or some of the mentoring programs there, are specifically focused on that. And what's measured is the rate of transfer of know-how and knowledge between people, not just in the same operations, but internationally. And one of the things, and I don't know what the figure is now, but at one stage they had 400 mentors across Europe whose role was simply focused on knowledge transfer. So those are just some of the ways we measure. I think what depresses us sometimes is how many programs we go into and they can't actually give us any measures to tell us whether the program is effective or not. They don't know what's going on for the participants, and that's challenging. But we want to measure, because if we don't measure, it's just all input. We have no idea whether it's actually achieving what we want or not. You can't improve it if you don't measure it. And there's lots of reasons we want to measure. We want to find out what's going on. What is the environment in which this is happening? How is this program actually influencing the environment and being influenced by the environment? We want to see if the program is working. Is it actually the best it could be? We want to see and we want to troubleshoot individual relationships. So many programs just launch mentoring and just assume that people are going to be good enough, that they're going to have nice, meaningful conversations. And of course, that's wishful thinking. That if we are overly focused on measuring outputs, or overly focused on measuring inputs, we constantly go, for what purpose? How is this actually going to either make the program any better, or improve the lives of the people who are part of the program, So what is it? What are we doing it for? And a lot of measurement is just there because somebody says we've got to have a measurement. And one of the problems within the NHS, for example, is everything gets measured, and nobody knows what's most important. And so we do have a culture of excessive measurement. But if we go back and say, what are we trying to do with this program? How can we make it deliver what we want? Then I think we have a rationale and reason for the measurement. But if we have measurements that are simply there because we need their measurements, then that's really, I think, a big issue. I mean, we were having I had some deep fun with a company that I sold my company to, and they had a 360-degree appraisal system. And I brought 360 to the West from Russia, where it was decades ago, and did the first experiments in the West. And it was designed in Russia as a process for keeping line managers under the thumb. And it hasn't changed a lot really here. And what was going on in the company, they had a 360 which was generic and full of nonsense. So it had all sorts of questions. They were measuring, but nobody knew why they were doing it. And they said, well, it's to test how well our managers are doing. It's supposed to be helpful in their development plans. Well, it wasn't connected to development plans, and the data in it wasn't very helpful. So it had questions like, or statements like, lives the company values? So I said, does anybody know what the company values are? And I couldn't find anybody to tell me, which was a little disconcerting. And what made it even less valuable was the fact that obviously you've got to have 10 people, and they're assigned to you. So this is all going against what we would regard as good practice. But so of the 10 people that were supposed to report on me, 5 of them I met once a year. Only. It was the only interaction we had, and that was at the Christmas party when we were all. So this was a great way of getting good feedback. Yeah, and what had happened was this need to feel that by HR to feel that they were measuring things had got in the way. And I think you're absolutely right. If we just measure for measurement's sake, it's not helpful. In fact, it gets in the way. So we do want to measure to troubleshoot, and this is demonstrating ROI. It's, do the funders need to know that the money's been well spent? And I think in an academic program, the program we're going to talk about in a moment, there is a requirement from the funders to say, actually, you have achieved the objectives that you said you would. But just measuring ROI independently of that, I would question whether it's needed. So what we found is you need to measure at various points. We need to measure before the program starts. And the reason we need to do that is we need to find out, is it actually worthwhile even starting mentoring? I recall going into one organisation and doing what we would then call a development climate survey, seeing how hostile or positive the organisation was towards mentoring. Would it support mentoring? And then reporting back to the board, or the executive top team, that this was the most hostile environment towards development I'd ever encountered in any organisation. And what we actually did was then arrange for them to go, and that measurement enabled us to get them to go back in and actually say, well, what are we going to do about it? So they attended every single call, so the chief executive did. And when we put in all sorts of things that were enabled, that would actually change the structures, that would actually make it possible for people to spend time on mentoring and not feel that they would be penalised. Yeah, and so by the measurement up front, before the program starts, I think is important. Measuring too the expectations of people. In one particular program, we found that the mentors had totally the opposite expectation of what mentoring would be about compared to the mentees. And nobody considered this until we were able to find that data and actually then get to say, okay, what are you guys going to do about it? And then we were able to come to some new ways of managing it. We want to measure whether the training was any good. One of the things that we frequently find is that is at the end of the training session, we want to ask, do people feel confident they can go out and apply what they've learned? one of the obvious questions, typically we ask we have the typical happy sheet. It doesn't really address that. It just says, what's the learning? Was it useful? What would you like more of? What would you like less of? But actually, are you now able to go out and use what you've learned? We need to measure before each review session. We'd also say, actually, we'd recommend that you measured or at the end of the second meeting. So what we recommend is that mentor-mentee discuss, is this relationship going to work? Now, you then need to, as the program coordinator, to measure, did they have that discussion? Because if they didn't, there's something wrong. And then before you would hopefully get them together at least once every 6 months, just to talk, to help them, to upskill them, to give them some more confidence, and so forth. So you'd want to measure then, so you've got data, so the data that enables you to work, to design the review session day or half day or webinar or whatever it is, to address the issues that have been thrown up. What's the most common issue that comes up between mentor and mentee as a problem, about the halfway point? There are two particular ones. One of the issues is challenge, that both mentor and mentee are likely to say, we're not getting enough challenge in the relationship. We're being too nice to each other, which is logical when you think about it. The second one is something we call relationship droop. And in relationship droop, what basically happens, you deal with all the shallow issues, but you never get to any depth. Then after 3 or 4 meetings, you run out of things to talk about. And so if you've got the measurements in place, and you know that these are the things that happen, you can test for those. And then you want typically a mentoring relationship would last for 12 months, could be shorter, could be longer, but you want to see what happened, what were the outcomes? Did anything change for people? And then, very few programs do this, but we're beginning to see a lot more interest in doing it. 2 or 3 years later, coming back and saying, okay, what's the long-term impact of this been for you? And it really is, it's quite interesting how long it can take before the penny drops. The mentor says something or asks a particular question, and it takes a long time for it to percolate through. I had an email just about this time last year, and it was somebody who said, you won't remember me, but 15 years ago, you were kind enough to give me some time at the end of a conference, and you asked me you did some mentoring for me, and you asked me a few questions. Said, and 2 of those questions are stuck in my mind ever since. Said, I've been thinking about those questions constantly. Said, 2 years ago, I finally answered one of them, and I changed completely my career. I don't know what the questions were. I don't even remember him. But here's this guy who sat on these questions. They percolate. 13 years it's taken for those questions to have an impact. And we find frequently, maybe not that long, but it's frequent for to say 6 months, a year, 2 years before the penny drops. Have you got examples for this? Have you encountered this phenomenon? Has it happened to you? I suspect if you think about it long enough, there'll be something that you recall that somebody said to you that's had that impact. I think we have such an impact, but if we expect it to happen like that, very often the real impact of the mentoring is months or years later, and we don't have a really good way of measuring that. But there's a guy called Donald Nunes who's doing some research in Hawaii, and he's looking at father and son, mother and daughter partnership or mentoring partnerships, where they're both working in the same industry or the same firm. And a lot again, he's coming up with this phenomenon that something that's said may take a long time to percolate. You only realise how wise your parents were a lot later, if ever. I'm still waiting for my sons to realise how wise I am. I may have to wait a very long time. Some programs we also looked at the peers of the mentee, because how have they reacted to it? What about people wanted to come on the programme but couldn't because there weren't enough places. So there's lots of different people that we might want to consider. The methods I'm going to talk about in a minute. The timing. We had one programme where they rather stupidly put out the request for or the questionnaires on their survey at the end of the year when everybody was busy trying to do the end of the year budgets. It didn't go down very well. They didn't get much return rate, as you can imagine. And just being clear about the questions. We've seen some questionnaires with 40 or 50 questions. People won't fill in more than 10 maximum. So we have to be, we have to be clear about we have to make people how we make it easy for people. We can get feedback in all sorts of ways. From surveys, that's a standard way, but the big problem is people get surveyed out. And we can use facilitated focus groups. Those are great, but then we've got to get people together. Now we've actually found that webinar-based focus groups are really effective, with a clear time limit on them. One-to-one conversations, usually telephone-based. Those are very helpful. You can use your steering group for that too. So they can do that. They can do those formally or informally. Just get them to look after a small number of relationships and go and talk to them informally and gather data. And then the social forums. This is increasingly becoming the most useful way of gathering data. Having a LinkedIn group or something like that where people exchange information, seeing the themes that are coming up on those LinkedIn groups. That gives us a lot of data about what's happening informally. So all of these ways, and there are lots of others, but these are the critical ones that we've found, the most common ones now, of getting the data from participants. So it's multiple types of data, and what happens is that some people will contribute to some things, but not to others. So some people will avoid coming to a focus group, but are quite happy to do something on the social media. So what you get is, if you've got a mixture of them, you get more people. I think we've covered most of this. We can measure mentoring in all sorts of ways. Julie's talked about, and Chris have talked about longitudinal studies, and Chandana has built in longitudinal studies. There is a real shortage of longitudinal measurement. People tend to just do let's look at what happened at the end type survey. Doesn't actually give you the information that you need to understand the mechanics of mentoring in the organisation. So the more longitudinal studies we can do, particularly if they go after, so they go beyond the mentoring scheme, the better. We've talked about the 4 types of individual outcomes, and we've talked about organisational outcomes. We mentioned briefly the international standards, and I'll come back to those. What problems have you had with measurement? Any particular ones that you've had?
You mentioned response, getting response rate.
Getting a response, yeah. I think that's the typical, one of the biggest ones for people, which is why we want to have multiple different ways of doing it. Particularly if it's a multi-country or multi-culture program, you get things like, if you put in, do you feel challenged in the relationship, or do you feel challenged in your job role? For example, Americans will tend to say yeah, and people in Europe will say no, I'm coping all right. So you have to be really careful about how the data is interpreted, and so testing it out on a group of people before you actually do it is obviously standard practice, and also I think just benchmarking against other people. Just saying, what questions did you ask? So if you've got other people that you know who've been doing mentoring programs, go and ask them, what questions did you ask? And so that way, we begin to benefit from other people's mistakes. I think one of the problems for me is whether we're measuring actually whether cause and effect something. Yeah. And the example I give here about talent pools, the data increasingly suggest that when organisations think that they must be good at selecting talent because the people they selected have gone up the organisation, what they don't realise is just that they are creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, and actually when you dig into it you find that the selections weren't very good. I'm putting a comparison with coaching because I think it's interesting with the return on investment in coaching. This thing about short-term and long-term objectives. What the sponsor may want is a short-term outcome. but actually what the coachee may want is the long-term outcome, and those two things may be completely different. Actually, the goal that gets set at the beginning is rarely the goal that somebody works on, ultimately, because it changes. As they begin to understand their internal context, their external context, the goal itself will evolve and mutate. We find that the things that people want to measure are usually the things that are easiest to measure. And this whole thing about client self-assessment, in observing coaches in real coaching situations with real clients, and then getting data from feedback from the coach and from the client, what we found is that the assessment of the client, the coaching client, of whether the coaching was any good, is completely random. Assuming that they are naive as in terms of not having experienced coaching before. And the reason for this is because if they are so unused to anybody listening to them, that they just feel it must be good because this person sat there for an hour and listened to me. That makes me feel really good. If they've experienced good coaching before, it's a bit more realistic. If they have been trained as a coach, it's actually quite close to the view of a trained assessor. So, but we have this issue that self-assessment is quite a difficult one, and people tend to want to say, I've invested all this time, of course it's been useful. So we have to be very careful with self-assessment. So this issue of goals, let's just talk about that briefly. The initial goal, my own research and a whole variety of other research tells us the initial goal that somebody sets is frequently a distraction. And if we try and measure, did they achieve that original goal, that's not a valid measurement, because if it hasn't evolved, the mentoring hasn't been any good, basically. And so some of the things with SMART goals, without going into enormous detail here, these are some of the things that research shows. My favourite example is the risk-taking issue. People tend to if the smarter the goal, the more likely people are to take risks when they're going to miss that goal. So the slopes of Everest are full of the bodies of people who knew that they should have come down because they weren't going to have time to get to the top and down again, but said, no, I've done all this effort, of course I'm going to get to the top. And they might get to the top, but they don't get down again. And so there's some real issues around that. And unethical behaviour, what we find is that people who focus on really smart goals and they're just about to miss them, and there's a lot at stake, their primary reaction is to cheat. So there's a whole range of issues here around this. Smart goals don't even motivate. Only 25% of people, according to this study, are motivated by smart goals. So increasingly we're beginning to build up a picture. If somebody insists upon having a smart goal to measure the quality of the mentoring by at the beginning, this may not be that helpful. And this is what the research tells us. It's much more nuanced. It's much less simple than so many of the textbooks make out. In this particular case, this was coaches again, but look at the data. 200 executive coaches, all but 9 found that the goals their clients had set changed significantly over the period of the relationship. From quite a lot of interviews with mentors, it seems clear that the same phenomenon happens with mentoring. And the way that we move towards goals, we're affected by all of these things. I'm not going to go through them all in depth. But how important is this goal to somebody? Right at the beginning, could we measure the importance, the level of importance? Yes, we could. There are the scales of commitment to a goal that we could apply. Could we measure contextual awareness? We haven't got a valid measure of that at the moment. Ownership. There are ways of establishing whose goal is it, and the degree of ownership that the person feels versus other people setting it for them. So you can get some sort of approximate to that. Goal clarity, not easy to measure. Measurability is the obvious one. Is it a fixed or moving target? Will the goal actually change? Or will the context change? So if the goal that you're aiming for is the job that you're aiming for, my goal is to get to that job, will that job actually be there And if it's not, is it a failure that you didn't get it because the job wasn't there? Or does the mentoring actually help you to think about a much wider context and make you more marketable, if you like? We don't know how to link it to personal values in a coherent way. We can measure personal values, but we don't know. We can't actually do a cause and effect for different values, helping to achieve different goals. And does this person actually have a habit of success? Because if people, we know that the work on stretch goals tells us that you can only achieve stretch goals when two particular variables are present. One is that you have the energy that comes from having been successful previously, and the other is that you have the support around you to achieve that goal. So there's the resources. So are those variables present for this particular person in their circumstances? So actually, we really can't measure most of this, not in a consistent way. Now, it's possible to construct a study and create with people working in a particular context and a particular organisation and a particular way, but you would but it would be very difficult to construct. The goal hierarchy too. What kind of goal is this? Is this a superordinate goal, something that is about your meaning, the meaning of life for you, or is this something that's below it? And if it's a subordinate goal, does it link into your superordinate goals, into who you want, the person you want to be? These are all questions that we can't really measure at this stage. So I think this statement, we so often talk about coaching mentoring as goal conversations. They're not. What they are is learning conversations. We can, to some extent, measure the quantity and quality of learning, but to some extent. So we can talk about the things that somebody wanted to learn and the fact and whether or not they feel that they have significantly advanced in that learning, or they can demonstrate learning in practice by doing things they weren't able to do before. Again, demonstrating that in a meaningful way is quite difficult. And we're back to self-report, which is a difficult one to manage. So looking at some of the managements we would do before the program starts, we would look, is the organization ready? What's the climate like? What are the participants' expectations people have? And then we can look forward to, what are the expectations of behaviors? How do mentors expect mentees to behave? Who's going to take responsibility for what? So actually identifying what people expect from each other. People's expectations of the level of support from the organisation. We know that the level of support influences the quality and of the relationship, and also the potential of the relationship to fulfil its objectives. But what specifically are they expecting? So is there obviously training helps, and there've been a couple of studies that show that. But what other levels of support? Is there somebody there for them to go and talk to if it isn't working? What's the impact of that? We could, in theory, measure that. We've talked about this one. The periodic reviews, we've talked about most of the things here, but we want to actually, how are people moving through the stages of a mentoring relationship? Have they gone beyond building rapport and really into some sense of creating a purpose for the relationship? What's the quality of it? Does mentor and mentee both feel they're having meaningful conversations? Do they feel that they're actually able to trust each other? Now, we can do good measures of trust. We've identified 7 factors of trust in a mentoring relationship, for example, which you can measure. The depth of discussion, which is actually the way of avoiding the relationship group, because the deeper you get, the better. Can we measure the depth of discussion? Not yet, but there are some thoughts around developing a study, which could be a really interesting research project into the quality, the depth of discussion that people get into. And that's a whole area for a research student to get involved with at some stage. We've talked about outcomes. There are outcomes for the individual, outcomes for the mentor-mentee. Julie mentioned measuring for the mentor. I think the learning that the mentor gets is one of the most important things to measure. Again, we tend to do it in very general terms. It would be possible to actually break that down into in more detailed terms, and for certain types of program, that would be, I think, a core thing to do. When we measure, we've really sort of covered a lot of this. We want to measure the processes, we want to measure outcomes, we want to measure what happens for the program and for the relationship. Having this balanced portfolio really works. And what we've found is the programs where the measures have been used most effectively to make improvements have had sort of up to 10 items spread across those 4 quadrants. Above that, you start to it just gets messy, and you're asking people too many questions. But you can see within those 4 areas, if you've got some data in all 4 of them, you can use it for improving the relationships, for troubleshooting, and for demonstrating ROI. So that would, I guess, be recommended good practice. The international standards, they've been going now for about 8-9 years. They were set up by people in 12 countries who've been all with lots of experience of either academics or practitioners running mentoring programs, and they look at the program purpose, the matching, the selection, the training, the pastoral care, how you look after people, the ethicality behind it, and so forth, and the measurement processes. And they have just been taken over, or they're just in the process of being taken over by the European Mentoring and Coaching Council. So they'll be administered by them as of next month, which means I don't have to do anything more on that. I can resign my role as chairman. What else we got? Here we go. I think sort of coming to a close on this, for me, one of the biggest problems with measuring mentoring is that the literature is all based on, or the American literature in particular, is all based on the work of Kathy Cram in the very early 1980s. And Kathy had a sample of 22 people, mentoring pairs, sponsorship mentoring pairs, all men, and all in a very much a professional context. And the trouble is, this was not representative of anything except that particular context and group. And what Kathy came out of it was a bunch of what she called functions. And Kathy herself would say that she called them functions because she couldn't find any other word to describe them. They were a mishmash of behaviours and roles and so forth. And the assumption has been made in so many studies that those functions, so the more of those functions that were exhibited, the better the quality of the mentoring relationship. There is neither logically nor in any other way is there any evidence that assumption is true. So something like 90% of the American quantitative literature on mentoring is based on a complete house of cards. There is nothing to support it, which is pretty frightening, isn't it? Because it's quite possible for a mentor to be highly effective, but only doing one of the functions. So I recall one of my mentors, for example, who was utterly useless, complete waste of space, except for the fact that he flew me over to New York to have a meeting with him, and we spent an hour, and he basically talked me through the politics of McGraw-Hill. And he explained to me that I was the most senior non-American in the corporation, apart from people who who were naturalized Americans or were living in New York. But in their overseas dominions, I was the most senior senior executive in the corporation, and I was an anomaly. And that politically, they couldn't promote me anymore, and the probability was that they would put somebody over my head to do my job, and I would have to teach them what to do. And because that was the way the politics worked in the organisation, that was the day I decided to leave. But that guy, this was the first time anybody had been honest to me and explained the politics of the organisation. Now, he did me a great favour. It was, in that particular moment, a brilliant mentor. Useless at any other time, but perfect in that point. So, I think the idea that mentoring functions tell us anything, or that we can measure the quality of mentoring by measuring the different functions is nonsense. And so we have to be incredibly careful in terms of our evaluation if we try and use instruments or data that is built out of research that's been built that goes back to this fallacious assumption. We really have a problem here. And of course it ignores the part of the mentee. It's all about what the mentor does. But the mentoring relationship is about two people having a conversation, and it depends not just on what the mentor does, nor on what the mentee does, it's on what they do together. So if we want to measure the effectiveness of a mentoring relationship, we have to look at the dynamics of the two people and recognize it's what they both bring that creates an effective mentoring relationship, not what one or other of them brings. I think for me that's a fairly dramatic way of bringing all this to an end. So I would add to that by pointing out that mentoring is about, one of the definitions we have of mentoring is that mentoring is about using one's wisdom to help somebody else develop their wisdom.